Hello everyone, today we talk about Seljuk infantry. Not really an unusual topic just per se, but the stereotype of the Turk is the horse archer, the elite heavy cavalryman at most, and given the Central Asian origin of the Turks, this the steppe context from which they emerge, we do not immediately associate them with infantry warfare, but as any steppe warfare connoisseur knows, or not even a connoisseur, just anyone who has minimal introduction to those cultures and their military, of course, the steppes are not just, and not even entirely in the most extreme sense, nomadic, and infantry always plays some role, of course not a dominating one. That much is true. Horsemanship dominated the military landscape of these areas, but there were, of course, in semi-nomadic, but sometimes in strictly speaking sedentary contexts, of course, important infantries that even against this overwhelming amount of waves of different nomads, etc., would survive and would oblige, of course, also the other people, of course, to cope with them on foot, which was, of course, obvious, as we just stated, even within the same nomadic contexts. When we talk about the Seljuk Turks, that we didn't discuss extensively, at least, on Schwerpunkt, I have a handful of videos on them. Of course, we have in store a lot of stuff. We did make some battle videos, especially looking at crusade tactics, and so one of their opponents with single battles in which we have in fact laid out that sort of idea of the elite, numerically and qualitatively speaking, heavy cavalry, and then these swarms of horse archers, a bit as the stereotype of the Turk in the Near East, as opposed to the Egyptians, for example, that were much more Western and on foot in their way of war, if we can approximate at least to the concept of Western military culture that they didn't technically belong to, of course, but in a broader Mediterranean sense. We have seen how the complexity in the formation of the same Seljuk sultanates, there was originally only one, affected their military, right? So it's obvious that the greatest amount of information about Seljuk infantry comes from the Levant. There was better documented definitely in Central Asia, just even the Middle East, thanks mostly to Western sources, the Franks fighting the Crusades, but also merchants, etc., and especially because of the more sedentarized nature. These are the Western extremes of Turkic settlement that obliged the locals to fight way more than their usual ethnic origin would inspire them to fight on foot. And regarding, aside from the terrain that naturally is more mountainous, let's say horsemanship had an important role, of course, on the Anatolian plateaus, etc. Just the other day we were talking about Armenian warfare, and we've seen how much, of course, equestrian culture there is in among all these peoples, right? It's also obvious that we're talking about something different from the ethnic Turks, strictly speaking, right? This could go a long way as a digression, simply because it's obvious. What are we talking about? Were the Ottomans actual Turks in an ethnic sense? Were these Central Asian people? Of course, there was a Turkic elite, Turcified elite to some extent, just like when you look at the Arab conquests, technically, most of the invaders were not Arabs, right? Not even remotely. They were mostly other peoples under Arabicide elites. And here we look a bit at the same thing, and because especially from the Sultanate of Rum, that is, in fact, the most westernized of all, the one that, as we've seen, uses even Frankish and Byzantine mercenaries in its own armies. I made a video specifically on that. You have unavoidably a greater use of infantry. And so who were these guys? Were they Turks, Turkic invaders, or were just local Anatolians in many ways? Well, ethnically and genetically, this is a rhetorical question. Of course, the majority of the Anatolian population had nothing to do with Central Asians. However, from a military point of view, as you know, the Turks and their arrival from the Middle Age, the early Middle Age, or even before, from late antiquity, in these waves, right, that substantially won the steppes to them over the previously dominated Iranians, were associated with the concept of gulams, right, of slave soldiers, or Mamluks. We've seen them recently. What was that video? Yes, we talk about the Ottoman Timurid army and sort of the retinues of the individual sipais, and we've seen how there were, of course, still in that very westernized context by Islamic standards, heavy traces of this, we can say, essentially feudal culture of the great steppe warlords that the Seljuks had brought with them. The origins of the Seljuks are complex and interesting. They're connected with the collapse of the Oghuz Khaganate. There are, again, I will make videos about that. I made actually a video about the Oghuz army organization from, I think, 3 years ago, and I have to re-upload it with copyright-free pictures because they're blurred now. But that's a good introduction, a bit at least to the types of armies that they had, but we'll have to come back on that prepotently in order to explain better. There is a Eurasian Steppes warfare playlist that, as you know, I made last year, and that I should even complete technically, but I explain at some point why I didn't do so, which highlights a bit the. We didn't talk about the Seljuks, but you know there is a quite broad look at Turkic warfare throughout the eras, the ages. It's important to get acquainted with that sense of waves of further settlement and so on. So when you look at the peak of the Seljuk Sultanate, that was essentially a heavily Persified one, in fact centered on the Iranian plateau, but nominally stretching from the Aegean Sea to eastern Iran, right? By the time of Manzikert, you have immediately, just from a geographical point of view, and all the sort of political, ethnic, and cultural awareness of the peoples inhabit there, how widely varied Seljuk warfare would actually be, right? So I signed for the stereotype that is fundamentally correct that we delineated before, especially in the Mashrek as such, from millennia before. Of course, infantry had a prominent role in the form of mountaineers, shepherds that had a quite tough, background. They weren't nothing special in absolute terms. I mean, these areas did not really have a state. These weren't really professional soldiers of some sort. At this point, of course, there was some important military organization imposed by these rulers and the various polities and states that had formed. But in general, you have plenty of these troops that are just there. They're part of the local inhabitants that adapt also to the Turkic domination. They have settled also after the case of Anatolia, for example, is quite exemplar. Like, yes, the Seljuks of Arslan crushed the Byzantine army. Not entirely, by the way. Manzikert was not that total disaster that is usually described like, both in tactical and strategical terms. But the interesting thing is that after the dam is broken and the Anatolian hinterland is invaded, you actually have plenty of other peoples that had nothing to do with the Turks that had actually even been pouring in before that, right? The Byzantines were controlling. There are Kurds, there are Iranians, there are Slavs even, and of course Turks. But these are all populations that somehow adapt to the picture. They're not even nomadic. And that settle and will provide later on the militias for the namely Seljuk, because that was the point. The dynasty basically had initially controlled everything, but eventually, as soon as they conquered everything, they parcelized it, they fragmented. This is typical, right? By the time of the First Crusade, the Seljuk threat had began to wane already. And that, in fact, would serve as essentially local militias, levies. And so these are the Seljuk infantrymen that we're discussing here, right? Not ethnic Turkic infantry that actually was out there in Central Asia, in the steppes, up to China, right? As a matter of fact, I will insert this video about also in the enemies of medieval China, because I make that sort of series enemies of things like Rome or Byzantium, etc. Because of course that's how far they span, right? And the background is difficult even to separate, because technically even the Anatolian shepherd, let's say, was not radically opposite as a fighting individual from, say, some Seljuk Turk infantrymen at the boundary of Chinese controlled territory. All right, we also get less documentation about those places, but I think it's very important to note that from some ceramic bowls we look at indicators that tell us how influence also from the external all these various Turkic infantries really were. Right, there are some leggings, lace leggings, for example. In some of these, as you know, there is not too much iconography about the Seljuk Turks available, but there is this famous ceramic bowls that illustrate mostly cavalry, telling you the truth. But in one instance, you find this infantryman wearing lace leggings that look dramatically close to the Tocharian and even Scandinavian ones, right? Here I didn't insert the century because, of course, the Seljuks are limited to a certain era. So here we're not subdividing it. We're talking mostly the 11th, the 13th century. But if you look at the previous time, and so wherever was the Turkic background as a whole, because was here, like it's not that the Seljuks would represent just Turks their own style, right? They would represent something that was pretty similar to other Turkic dynasties, right? And what their warriors looked like from that primitive Central Asian background. And you definitely realize that there is a lot of influence from other populations. We talked about Tocharian warfare in a dedicated video. So if you're interested, you can check that out, both for ancient and medieval warfare. The Scandinavian connection is, and the Tocharians were in between, basically, the Tharim Basin, etc. So, this nomads would go back and forth. The area had been Turkicized, basically. But the Scandinavians too are. The Vikings, the most traceable Vikings, of course, arrive up to places like the Caspian Sea, etc. But yeah, Vikings surely arrive to places like India or China, and there is nothing strange like going there in the steppe to see someone who, aside from the various Aryan background, like is pretty blonde and tall, and speaks a Germanic language, because that's where these guys had been roaming from centuries and centuries. We've seen it in the video about the Franks and the Byzantines in the Seljuk army too, which is based on a famous relief from Anatolia. It could be representing Turks, telling the truth, but with heavy Western influence. And yet we know, of course, that there were Frankish mercenaries, Western mercenaries, that if you go back in time to the 11th century, we can't even distinguish from the Vikings, technically, aside from their background. That, of course, had been around, just around the time that the Seljuks had risen to power, and that surely had been fighting also in their armies and fighting with them. So there is really a lot going on in the steppe that unfortunately is not documented as it should be for our historical guilty pleasures. And I know this sort of ethnic, like high medieval fringe of the earth vibe is very popular on the internet. I am, of course, fascinated with it, but I never buy, as you know, into the most sort of popular trend. So by instinct, by immediately. But of course, it's a relevant military historical context to appreciate and to understand better, even to think what, for example, one of these Seljuk infantrymen would have looked like, right? The Chinese tracked these guys as well, so there was a significant influence from China among the Turkic peoples. Warfare made, again, lots of videos so far about the Mongols, the Tibetans, etc. Other, say, Turco-Mongolian peoples that were at this point very close, of course, with one another from the spring of their nomadic movement. But it's obvious, again, that most of the evidence comes from the West, right? Most documentation, most observation comes from the West. So despite the prominence of cavalry in their armies, it's obvious, as we explained, that in the Near East, Seljuk infantry were not uncommon, right? This is evident from just the battles descriptions that we have on them. We do see, of course, infantry always playing a role. Again, you can't imagine a Sultanate of Rome's army being a nomadic army. They would have had infantry from their cities, from their countryside, etc. And we have, for example, a pretty good glimpse of this at the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176. This is one of the most important battles of the Byzantine-Turkic wars. Basically, it's Manuel Comnenus losing yet again, a bit like at Manzikert, right, during an ambush in a campaign that was aimed at the destruction of the Seljuk Sultanate. I mean, 1 century after Manzikert, the Byzantines were back on their feet. They had been eroding the Seljuk power in Anatolia, and now we're striking for Iconium. And the interesting thing about Myriokephalon that is credited, but they lost everything after that, is that actually the war went on for years after the Byzantine defeat in the Anatolian hinterland, to the point that Iconium at some point, Konya, was evacuated. The population was fled at some point, because evidently the Byzantines were still threatening. We have a very interesting couple of letters sent respectively by the Byzantines and the Seljuks to Frederick Barbarossa, that basically say, each saying that they were winning and that the enemy, of course, was losing as a consequence. And that tells you pretty much how foggy this whole thing is. We have some sort of sketchy source information about what this Battle of Myriokephalon actually was. We do not... Manzikert is much more easily reconstructible. I read the sources for Myriokephalon. It's a bit more difficult. We'll surely talk about the battle if we go on. We meet it at some point in the cycle. Hopefully, we'll still be here by then. But it's a typical ambush at some gorges of the Anatolian hinterland, and there is a lot of infantry, just because of the nature of the terrain in many ways. Some of these guys would have been just dismounted horse archers, don't get me wrong, but Manzikert was a much more open ground, and there you see the most typical Turkic horse archery at play, with its unnerving, extenuating role, right, for which till the last you never know whether out of that dust, other than arrows, some actual heavy cavalry would arrive, which is what Arslan effectively would go with, even though they wouldn't manage to break through the entire Byzantine formation. That battle is... I must confess to you this, that it was one of the first... I think it was the first battle I ever made a video on, Schwerpunkt, but during the re-upload cycle, I told you other times, it's actually the only video that went lost right? I re-uploaded all of, I don't remember how many, were like 800, something like that. Yeah, it was crazy. There are just 200 left. I stopped, as you know, from a while doing that, but the audio is always available, but the only one I lost was that one. I think another one, too, about something about the Longbirds, but, I mean, they were very primitive videos. The one about Massacre was not that bad, actually, as an analysis, but it was pretty old, so if I arrive in the cycle at that, again, I will promise I will make another video about the Battle of Massacre. But, you know, that described well how things really worked in that battle. Well, you see, things had not changed 100 years later, so with Myriokephalon, we appreciate of course, the infantry, right, are harassing the Byzantines as well. Doesn't mean that these were particularly different tactics from the one that the Turks would habitually use. And again, because, you know, if you can't go on horseback, you go on foot everywhere in the steppes, like in Anatolia. It sounds dumb to say, but to point out at least, but it's obvious, right? And one should not make too much figuranism and wargamesm about these various categories. We have Anna Komnena recording as many as 80,000, quote, fully armed infantry. This could be an exaggeration, actually it is. I mean, there weren't armies bigger than 50,000 at this point. It already at that, you know, you can look with some skepticism, meaning that we're often much less. But when we look at the Turkic side, again, the fact that there were lots of lighter troops, as we see also from Crusader and Islamic sources, yes, it does make sense. Often the Muslims were in numerical advantage, right? Just they had lower quality in that sense. But here, Anna Komnena stresses at least the fact that the Seljuk panoply was cool, right? It would have been the equivalent of an armatus in Latin. Guys that had their own gear for an armament for engaging to hand-to-hand combat, right? This is recalled for the first crusade at Heraclea, where in 1097, right? So obviously we are in an Anatolian context, which surely mirrors the Anatolian wealth here, right? The Sultanate of Rome, as you know, is the name of Rome, of course, referring to what had impressed the Muslims much, I mean, to have occupied what was the land of Rome, right? The land of the Byzantine Empire, which, in spite of the desertification, the pastoralization that followed in the Anatolian hinterland, like in Byzantine times, there were more dams, irrigation, stuff like that, still was a pretty, say, advanced place. I mean, at least compared to most of what the, say, on average, like it was not that bad, right? It was not a particularly backward area, right? Naturally, this infantry would have come, as we were saying before, from militias. We will see it in some other video that, in fact, had been continuing to exist, to work in the same ways from Byzantine times, all right? And here, the fully armed idea from Anna Komnena, that this infantryman probably has also something to do with that. Naturally, we do not have to think about particularly effective infantry here. We do not witness particularly sophisticated urban militias. I made multiple videos some months ago also about the Fatimid army. We've seen how in Syria, especially, there was an important level of urbanization. The local militias did play a role in the under the various Islamic dominations. Anatolia is not really like that, right? It's something slightly, in fact, slightly wilder, but still, right? It has an important degree of sedentarization, of urbanization, even. And that's how what this area can provide with this large amount of decently equipped forces. They're just militias. Again, we do not have evidence of professionally drilled, infantrymen in large numbers. There were surely picked troops of infantrymen that could be also, actually horsemen, depending on the situation. The Turks maintaining their own equestrian bias, of course, and still, developing it in this newly conquered land. But still, the same conquerors tend to be absorbed by the conquered, to the point that you have this interesting hybrid here. Otherwise, if we were to stereotype the average Seljuk infantry, also for Anatolia, we would think of usually unarmored trooper, and especially essentially light infantry in the guise of javelinmen or archers, but also spearmen, right? We do not see particularly offensive pike, let's say melee weapons of some sort of, see pike militias. Pikes were there. There were surely some Seljuk infantrymen that used pikes also, but you do need large bodies of drill troops in order for such, for them to be effective with that weapon, and we do not see this much, right? For the, as we were talking about, the Battle of Myrocephalon, tough ground, gorges, valleys, hills, etc. You say rocky terrain, some desertic areas. You have this hit and run tactics continued by the infantry, where the cavalry could not really operate depending on the terrain. So that's the typical picture, and it was the typical picture, I would say, also for most mountaineer communities, just also in Byzantine times. Again, the Byzantines relied mostly on their town militias as a paramilitary force next to the Tagmatas bases, where still the Anatolian latifundia were there. At this point, there's a greater fragmentation, so it's obvious that you do see this previously, to some extent, even sort of not well off, but sort of satisfied peasantry working in a civil context. After the Turks arrive, it's a bit more like a literal Far West, at least from the Turkic perspective. And you have many of these guys that at the collapse of the system revert to some sort of mountaineer guerrilla forces, and that sell also their service to the highest bidder, and or that get framed, as we've seen, in the same way within the same Seljuk, that is Byzantine inherited military system, right? So that's basically the trend. We observe it also elsewhere. There were, I don't know, even when, for example, the Crusaders take over Constantinople in 1204, you have a similar collapse in Greece, the Balkans, and as we've seen in the videos about the Turkopoles, there were lots of Greeks that went fighting in places like Cyprus or even the Near East by becoming Turkopoles. That initially was, it means in Greek, like, children of the Turks, like it had an ethnic sort of meaning at the beginning, but by this point had become the synonym of a tactical specialty that was horse archery mostly, not only. But so in that sort of typically Turkic fashion, that after all had been adopted by most of the light cavalry of the Near East, because also of Turkic influence, and during this time, also with the arrival of the Mongols, there is a further injection of that, as lighter troopers. Right, whereas maybe at home they would have just served as spearmen in the local, I don't know, Greek town militias or something like that. So these Seljuk infantries follow pretty much, in other ways, the same development of, say, at least of the military technology of the time. For example, by the mid-12th century, at the latest, we see crossbows in use among them. It was nothing strange, like the crossbow was not really reinvented in the High Middle Ages. It had survived throughout the entire time from antiquity, even in the most depressed areas. So actually there's nothing strange about crossbows being there. I mean, even a Turk from Central Asia could have used a crossbow on horseback, right? It would have been nothing strange about that. Or maybe a bit, at least if you look at the average, but technically, like, say, the bow in itself, like, as a crossbow, can be very easily made, right? There's nothing revolutionary, special, technically sophisticated. You can have a garbage crossbow with very cheap cost and the benefits of that type of weapon next to the more widespread, of course, composite bow of the steppe. But, like other sedentary militias, in fact, you see the crossbow becoming more popular around this time, right? It was so in Europe, it was so if you look at the Near or Middle East, there was, like, say, aside from different shades here, the Middle East was more steppe-like, the Near East, as we've seen, was sort of more Western-like. But the weapon develops further, right? And it became an important infantry arm by the 13th century among the Seljuk infantrymen. Nothing strange about that. As we've seen, these are basically sedentary guys, most of which have nothing to do with Turkic ancestry, and that basically just follow the trends that their sedentary, say, town background would have had, even just, if the Byzantines had remained there. Actually, some of these really were. There were areas contended by both for a long time, and that sort of switched allegiance depending on the circumstances. We find some Rumi, so from the Sultanate of Rum crossbowmen, at the Battle of Aklat in 1230, protected, by the way, by large cowhide shields. This sounds something similar to the pavises in Europe. So scholars think that these were shields wielded by some bearers of sort. This is a very controversial topic. This year I should write an article about the use of pavises, about my time, the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, and I have a very strong opinion about pavises actually not having nothing to do with shield bearers, contrary to what it's commonly believed. Nobody really knows this. I mean, there is nothing scholarly written on this topic. There were some, for example, think about the XI-XIII, that were really sort of mobile planks of wood, etc., used during sieges, especially to counter, of course, mostly enemy fire, etc. But the concept that there were sort of shield bearers connected with the use of crossbows, etc., it's a bit of an inflated area. It's based mostly on speculation, and I personally do not support it at all, or especially in open field, right? If you're talking siege warfare, at that point you would have not had a shield bearer anyway, but at least you have the idea of the sort of mobile camping table that you could arrange wherever was more useful. But in that sense, it's not, even if there had been some crews like doing that, like those would have not been technically in that function fighters of some sort. It was not, there is no evidence of any sophisticated, complicated tactical interaction between the shield bearers and crossbowmen. At least there is no evidence, right? It's a great mystery. It's just like we talk about this in Assyrian warfare, for example, where you actually do see the guys, like at least one with a shield and the archer behind. Historically, there may have been things like this, but say I've never actually seen that. There is no proof for this in medieval warfare. I haven't seen that, at least in the West, meaning also in part of Western Eurasia. None of it. But this indication here of the larger shield, right? The cowhide, especially, is very, very pastoral, very Turkic, right? Very, even Anatolian, for that matter. We have them. We documented them even for the Urartians back in the day, and other populations of even of Transcaucasian. And considering the number of nomadic horse archery out there does make a lot of sense, don't get me wrong, but the fact that crossbow in here were just being fielded like that, I don't think there is any specific evidence for it. And again, the shield bearer's presence is pure speculation. It's not indicated by even the specific sources about the Battle of XI-XIII that we will hopefully see at some other point. So, talking clothes, we have a wide variety that we get from the ceramic bowls in a pretty decent way, mostly dark blue, light blue, turquoise, in fact, but also brown and tan, also black. We see probably more artistic more poetic representations depicting red, green, but most other colors would be worn as well. I mean, they would be pretty colorful. We'll make some videos about that. Also, of course, a way in which in the steppes you could recognize an opponent, but just also in a sedentary context. And the Turks had all a tradition with certain bands and other symbols that were employed like this. We have an interesting evidence from Azerbaijan showing the Seljuks using kite-shield, right? Which is, I think, the guy type I used in the thumbnail for an unusual type of Seljuk infantry. Anyhow, but the kite-shield would have not been unusual in this sense, and the history of this typology is, as you know, rooted in different areas, right? The Frankish one, the Byzantine one, the Arab one. Like, it seems that the kite-shaped shield developed more or less at the same time around the 10th century, at least becoming sort of... it was out there from before, but we associate it mostly to a sedentary context. Well, there is actually some association with cavalry as well. We see, I made multiple videos about Near Eastern Mesopotamian warfare as well during the same time, and you see how this, especially among the infantry, is quite common, right? But it could have had to do with also the development, of course, of a thigh cover for, you know, just the increased importance of infantry in turn. In sedentary context, say you have as a knight to cover yourself better from spearmen hits from the below. It's similar. Otherwise, from another Turkish bow, we see circular shields as well. So surely there were different typologies used at the same time. This is normal. Like circular shields were more prevalent in the steppes, but for reasons, especially among the lighter troops, but I'll say actually also the heavier ones. But because say for horse archery, it's easier to run with a lighter circular shield than the other way around. And if you're an elite trooper, you need actually a smaller shield, not necessarily a circular one. You know, in Europe we are habituated to the triangular shield that at the end of the day is still deriving from the kite shape over time. But say here we see, in fact, an interesting melange, a blend of what you would expect, in fact, from these guys. You could think they were infantrymen, yes, but they could jump a horse and just running away and going back to their nomadic equestrian lifestyle without too much of a problem, right? And it's interesting that these guys with the kite shape or the circular shield are depicted with a more sort of characteristic ethnic Turkic hairstyle, right? Which during this era seems to appear specifically in the eastern frontier areas, right? closest to the, say, amongst even, by the way, the sort of wild, much rougher, more primitive Turkoman nomads. Right, so these shield designs were evidently known. One thing I always say is that the steppe peoples, in a sense, at least as far as, geographical awareness of where polities were and what they were up to militarily, were much more informed, obviously, because they were living at the outskirts of them, trying to profit of their weakness of the sedentary world than a sedentary world near these guys. And so even, again, documentation doesn't help us too much because aside from this very precious evidence, we do not really know how these shield designs would actually develop. Like from the centuries, we have an idea, we have a sort of greater progression, more evidence, more details. Here we just know that there were also out there, and that likely followed a bit the same pattern of functionality that would among all the sedentary populations that were adopting them, as we've seen, simultaneously as shield types. Right, and in this case, I can't think of a reason why, again, the nomads would have not cared about that, especially in areas that were sort of slightly more affluent than the average Central Eastern Asian steppe dimension. So yeah, it kind of makes sense after all. There are alternative types of shields, by the way. Actually the elephant in the room here is Persian warfare, like that we will have to look at a bit more in depth in some other video during this time, because as we were saying, the Seljuks basically ruled from Persia, right? Especially Western Persia, and that had been, as you know, a cradle civilization and distinctive military culture from millennia, especially in a chivalric feudal fashion, which again heavily impacted the Seljuks, and that in this sense we have to dissect a bit let's say it was just Eastern Iran that, as you know, it's wilder, is poorer, is more open also to properly Central Asia, steppe peoples. In fact, displays a lot of that. So we'll have to see all these regions in progression in depth, because and I have them scheduled for the History of Warfare playlist/series. In all of this, however, what we see is still relatively typically Turkic, right? Styles are something, but when you get to the essentials of their armies, yes, they looked more, especially at the beginning, more Central Asian than, say, Persian, and they would sort of maintain. I mean, they were enlisted as gulams, etc., as say specialized troops in this kind of warfare, and that's why they got them from there. Because if they had been for a more sedentary context, you would have just seen a prevalence of those contexts. Think about the Dailimi. So we talk about that in some video, but the age, let's say, in the Islamic world, of the infantry trooper dominating, or like a mountaineer, etc. There were, again, in the Mashrek, this sort of specialties surviving up to relatively late, and sort of brutally and primitively managing to surpass even more sophisticated mercenaries. But those were the last spurts, let's say, of a mostly Arab-dominated warfare. Now the Turkic one had fully kicked in. I mean, the Seljuk Turks are the ones that really dominate in this regard. But the Persian contribution is indeed very important. I would spend a last word about the aforementioned Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176 to point out just what these Seljuk infantrymen were recorded doing. So essentially, the Byzantine wagons were harassed by Seljuk infantry, right? We had set some of them on fire as well. this could have apparently been done by horsemen. Actually, it would have been easier if we don't take in consideration terrain that was more very mountainous, sort of steep. It's a pass basically where the Byzantines were ambushed. So the idea is that also to carry out surprise attack, etc., you would have someone quite carefully sneaking into this, territory that, on horseback would have been sort of more complicated to do. And this produced, by the way, a jam in a narrow pass. Right, the Turks setting on fire the wagons completely blocked the road, and this contributed to preventing any retreat by the bulk of the Byzantine army. Right, it's at this point that the mass of the Turks closed in the disorganized Byzantines, even though we do not know exactly. Say the fight went on for a while, right? You have to imagine again, like proceeding into this pass, and a bit like at Manzikert, but on a closed ground. Like you have these guys attacking you every once in a while, some pockets, right? And in every ambush, you don't have immediately all the enemy mass coming out. Surprise in this sense is achieved only when you enter the bottled way, but at that point you will have single guys even, or some just bands that are attacking you. It is completely typical until like the bigger chunk arrives. That is, in an ambush, the guy who ambushes is ambushing because he's weaker in a more open terrain, right? So there is still some concern and safeguard, and you do not want to expose yourself. You don't want to make the enemy understand exactly where the bulk of your troops is. But that's where here the Seljuk infantry is more interesting, because it sort of carries out a special operation designed specifically to set on fire the enemy wagons. So probably these guys were equipped just like, I don't know, with some pitch, with some, capacity to set on fire wood more quickly. And they managed to create this mass for which the enemy troops could not retreat at that point, at least according to the sources that we have no clear idea. And that's where the battle sort of escalated. But it was possible, apparently, thanks to these infantrymen that would have been much swifter on a broken terrain than a clumsy cavalry on it. So it kind of makes sense. These are the tasks. Of course, you can imagine in siege warfare, infantrymen just being that important. In the steppes, there aren't many centers, but of course, also there, you would have had, I don't know, even wagon forts, of course, seeing dismounted horsemen fencing off the enemy in in that kind of on foot, like, of course, with that capacity. And this is the broader picture. Naturally, there could be always more one can point out. There are many instances in which you do find infantry counted among just the list of the troops of single Seljuk army, but eventually not hearing much of that, considering that, especially by the 13th century, the peak of feudalism, not even Western sources are telling you technically what infantrymen do, not at least normally, especially in the most feudal countries in Europe, on the battlefield. Like, that there were also many infantrymen, nobody talks about them, right? It's that disappointing. And here it's a bit similar, just less information in general, less attention to sort of analytical, rational battle explanation / description from Islamic sources that care about other things, and in general also a Turkic culture that really actually despises infantry. This is, I think, an important point missed here. That is quite evident among all the nomads, right? Those who fight on foot are disgusting. Even say more than in the West, right? In the West, there is at least a sense that the average infantryman is still sort of, that has a sort of liberty, some sort of capacity to keep themselves, to strictly cooperate, to actually with cavalry, to even be a pain in the behind, where if it's pretty stubborn in open field, etc., have great missile capacity, standing their ground, etc. In the steppes, there is a traumatically violent repression of every single form of subject. Right? It's the reason why there are these enormous swaths of horse archers without armor, because literally these are the subjects, peoples that have been stripped of all their wealth. I mean, in the steppes there is not that great amount of wealth in the first place, but the idea is that you're more of a loser if you have gotten there. This you can see it in Eastern Europe, for example, especially after the Mongol invasion. It's the violence against the peasants from the nobility is much greater. The contempt, the disgust, the constant repression, harassment is just there. It's a dysfunctional system, actually. It's just how much these guys, telling the truth, hate gunpowder when it comes around. We have a pretty good evidence of this. Like we think. So the Turks being, especially because of the Ottomans pioneered firearm technology. That's true, but it happened after actually a painful recognition of, say, the necessity of that. I mean, the Mongols, the Kipchaks, say, ridiculized the gunners because of their devils-like stench, talking sulfur. But properly, the idea that you were a coward if you used a missile weapon, even though, say, bows were so important also for the aristocracy in a way, the idea of fighting in a way that was not face-to-face, to the close, hand-to-hand combat was considered like the one of lesser people. And the infantry in that sense was a bit like this. I mean, the Anatolia, especially today, we talk a lot about that because, again, most of the evidence of this infantry comes from there. But of course, don't forget that these are not just Turks, and not even prevalently Turks. Properly also in the military cultural sense, their ancestry or whatever. So it's a much more widely accepted way of war there, and it had always been. Right, Anatolia had been historically, if you look at the Umayyads, the Abbasids, etc., the place where in the mountains, all the scum of all the various Islamic heresies, sects, whatever, was expelled from the Orthodox center. And that's a bit of the reason why, I don't know, Iran is Shia, right, and Mesopotamia is Sunni historically, so at least by majority. Things could have changed, like with Al-Mamun, etc., but the way they didn't, of course, have a meaning. And so the idea of the outcast, the idea of the guy that still has it has more individual, it's a more broken society, it's a more clanic reality, it's a place where the outcast has more room, right? So the Sultanate of Room, a dumb joke here, of consonants. But the sense, again, it's way more likely to see an infantryman here, right? But don't think either that, again, in Central Asia you couldn't see actually an infantryman, or communities even of Turks that had settled down. This doesn't have to be, I don't know, the towns, the cities of the Tarim Basin, all these more developed sort of centers of caravans, etc. It's and more. It could be literally just a space in the steppe that was unusually fertile, and some local Turks had settled down, and they fought more with infantry than with cavalry. We find surprisingly advanced islands of military culture in the nowhere, in the center of the freaking Eurasian steppes. I discussed this in the video about Mongol warfare. I remember which one, if it was Eurasian steppe warfare before Mongol, I don't remember. Well, you realize that the Mongols that we normally think, they were the strongest. They were the most advanced. They had the Chinese artillerists, technologists with them. They were hyper advanced. If you look actually at the archaeological evidence of the Mongol armies, the Mongol armies were brutally underdeveloped. I mean, their material culture was incredibly primitive and backwards, right? They were just pretty damn tough morally to keep all the thing together. They didn't probably need much of technology to make things work. And in fact, they overrun certain smaller centers that had managed to cultivate their wealth out there in the steppe with surprisingly advanced sort of arms, armor, whatever. But of course, however, were insignificant in front of Mongol power, were overrun. And you have these exchanges from both sides, and so this makes you see the steppe in a much more variegated way that normally is sort of skipped and not adequately appreciated. That's the thing that I think one should always remember about this, about the steppes. I think that's what I want to leave you mostly with. And then of course we'll keep talking about the Seljuk Turks. I already made a video about the Seljuk Askaris. There's really a lot of stuff around because it's a journey not much into a subtle army, but into this sort of hybrid between, again, the steppes, nomads, and in fact something more Persian, more state-like, and there are all the possible shades in between that you can imagine. But I'm glad, again, we go step by step. It's really what this channel is about. Sometimes it can take some sprint, but it mostly depends on how I'm feeling. I'm actually going through a terrifying time. I don't know how I'm still making videos, but actually that's what keeps me awake in many ways. I don't know how long my problems are going to last now, but making these videos really helps, and I hope that I will come back pumping more sort of specials, more dedicated topics of sort of about traditional religion soon, because that would mean I have part of my problem solved at least, and I will let you know in case, but I will keep you updated because there are some things coming with my life that are very new. I also want to show you, and at some point, and I count on this. Like it's a great help in many ways. It makes you more focused, makes you more like you see there is a point for it, right? So the idea of completing all these various contexts, having a sort of encyclopedical approach to content making, I think it's really rewarding. It helped me, it helped my work, it helped writing my historical publications, etc. It's really, I could have not had what I have if I didn't do Schwerpunkt, and that's why I really care about what we have here. I hope that, in fact, you at least enjoy something I do. Yeah, but for today, stop it here. I really hope, in fact, that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.